Some of you think that Manchester City was founded in 2008, but you can't be further from the truth. What if we told you that Manchester City was founded years before Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Real Madrid, and even Barcelona? What if we told you that they won a trophy even before Manchester United? Crazy, right? Well, trust us on this show. It's about to get even crazier as we dig into the entire history of Manchester City Football Club. So, first, the name of the club wasn't always Manchester City. They were founded as St. Mark in 1880, and they had that name because the club was funded by members of St. Mark's Church of England in West Gorton, Greater Manchester. And you won't believe the reason this club came about in the first place. Back then, there was a problem of alcoholism, unemployment, and gang violence in the area. So, a couple of church wardens thought that the best way to curb that was to introduce new activities for young men in the area. And what better activity to attract men than football, right? Although the club was founded by a church, it was open to all the men in the area regardless of religion. So officially, St. Mark was founded by two men named William B. Stone and Thomas Goodbeer in 1880. Anyway, as you'd expect from a newly founded club, they played some horrible football in their first year. They won just one game in the entirety of that season. So you would say it was a very slow start. But they would slowly begin to pick up the pace and expand their reach in the process, which caused them to change their name to Ardwick Association Football Club in 1887. And then in 1894, the name was changed again, this time to the one you are familiar with now, Manchester City Football Club. Maybe the name change started to bring them good fortune, because 5 years after they started going by the name Manchester City, the club won their first ever trophy, the second division. And that earned them promotion to the first division, the highest level of English football. So, at the turn of the 20th century, Manchester City were rubbing shoulders with the biggest clubs in the country. Then, in 1904, they won their first major trophy, the FA Cup, after they beat Bolton Wanderers in the final. That made them the first Manchester club to ever win a major trophy. Yes, they won a trophy before Manchester United. That season, they nearly completed the double, but they narrowly missed out on the league title, finishing second in the first division. 2 years after that FA Cup win, 17 Manchester City players were suspended because of financial irregularity. The captain, Billy Meredith, was said to have bribed Aston Villa midfielder Alex Leke £10 to lose the match. Following his suspension by the club, he moved to Manchester United. Manchester City used to play their home game on a ground called Hind Road, at least until 1920, when a fire destroyed the main stand, which forced the club to move into a new stadium. In 1923, Manchester City moved to Main Road, and that was their home for 80 years. They were there until 2003, when they moved to the City of Manchester Stadium, which was built to host the 2002 Commonwealth Games. We'll get to that later. But there's still a lot more that happened in the 20th century that we haven't told you about. So, in the 1930s, Manchester City started to enjoy more success. They reached back-to-back FA Cup finals, losing to Everton in 1933 and winning against Portsmouth in 1934. Now, during that 1934 season, Manchester City broke a very interesting record. In the 6th round of the FA Cup on the 3rd of March 1934, they faced Stoke City at home, and 84,569 fans came out to Main Road to watch that game. That instantly became the highest home attendance any football club has ever recorded in the history of English football. They held that record until 2016, when 85,512 fans came out to watch a UEFA Champions League group game between Spurs and Leverkusen. But considering that game took place at Wembley Stadium, you will argue that Manchester City still holds that record. So you see that whole talk about Manchester City not having fans hardly hold water. They have had fans since television. Anyway, the 1930s continued to be very successful for Manchester City. They won their first league title in 1937. But the craziest thing happened the following season, which you won't believe. Manchester City got relegated a season after they were crowned champions. And guess what? The season they got relegated, they scored more goals than any other club in the league. Can you imagine that? The reigning champions got relegated after outscoring everyone else in the division. It was crazy indeed. But if you think the 30s were an interesting period in Manchester City history, try the 50s. During the 50s, the club came up with a system known as the Ravi Plan, named after their player Don Ravi. He was a striker, but he would often come deep into the pitch, dragging the opposition centre-back out of position, thus opening them up. In modern football, we call him a false nine. Anyway, the Ravi Plan helped City reach back-to-back FA Cup finals again. They lost to Newcastle in 1955, but they defeated Birmingham in 1956, and the 1956 final was so dramatic. With 17 minutes left on the clock, Manchester City goalkeeper Bert Trotman was knocked unconscious after he collided with an opponent, Peter Murphy. Murphy's knee hit Trotman's neck with some force, and the goalkeeper needed instant treatment. Substitutions were not permitted back then, so if he was to go out, City will have to play the game with 10 players. Trotman bravely insisted on finishing the game, and City ended up winning by 3-1. But guess what? 3 days later, after some tests was conducted, it was revealed that Bert Trotman had broken a bone in his neck during that collision. It was so insane, and that remained one of the craziest FA Cup final till date. But this period of heights were very quickly followed by a period of lows for the citizens. They were relegated in 1963, and it felt like they were losing their fans. In 1965, they hit a record low home attendance of 8,015, an insane drop from the record-breaking number some 30 years ago. But they would rise again, winning the FA Cup in 1969 and their first European trophy, the European Cup Winners' Cup, in 1970. That year, Manchester City also won the League Cup, becoming only the second ever English club to win a European trophy and a domestic cup in the same season. Half a century later, they would also become the second English club to complete the European treble, second to their neighboring rivals, Manchester United. And you know what? We could not just possibly talk about the history of Manchester City without talking about their neighbors. Doing better than Manchester United was always one of the aim of Manchester City, which is why City fans will always fondly remember the last game of the 1973-74 season. They played Manchester United, who needed a win to avoid relegation. But Manchester City beat them 1-0 to send the Red Devils down to the second division. And the goal was scored by Dennis Law, who previously played for Manchester United. It remains one of the sweetest victories in this club history. So yeah, it's safe to say that the 1970s were a good time for Manchester City. But what followed was an extended period of lows. In the 1980s, the club had 7 managers, none of whom was able to win any silverware. They got to the FA Cup final in 81 but lost to Spurs, and they got relegated from the top flight in 83 and 1987. They would come back to the first division in 1989 and finish in the top 5 in 1991 and 1992. And in 1992, they were one of the founders of the Premier League. The new league was supposed to mean a new lease of life for them, but they continued to struggle. They fought and struggled until they finally got relegated in 1996. After 2 seasons in the second tier of English football, they would get relegated yet again, becoming only the second winner of a European trophy to fall to the 3rd tier of football in their country. Then in 1998, David Breston became chairman of the club, introducing some strict fiscal measures and revamped the team. His approach brought the club some success as they gained successive promotion in Bernstein's first 2 seasons in charge, which meant that they were back in the Premier League in the year 2000. But they didn't last again. In 2001, they were back in the Championship. Then Kevin Keegan was hired that summer, and he brought them back to the Premier League in 2002 and managed to keep them there. Under Kevin Keegan, Manchester City began to compete again. In the 2002-2003 season, they beat Manchester United for the first time in 13 years and went on to qualify for Europe for the first time in 25 years, seeing significant progress. Then, before the start of the 2003-2004 season, the club moved out of Main Road after 80 years and moved into the City of Manchester Stadium, which is now known as the Etihad Stadium for sponsorship reasons. Then in 2007, the club did something they've never done before. They hired a non-UK coach for the first time in their history. Swedish manager Sven-Göran Eriksson, who was also England's first foreign manager, was hired to coach the Manchester City first team. He was a boss for just a year before he left by mutual consent. But he started the club's culture of signing managers from overseas, one which would eventually lead to the best manager in the club history. We'll get to that one later. But first, let us tell you about how this club life was turned around in the 2000s. In 2007, Thai businessman Thaksin Shinawatra took control of the club, but his assets were frozen in 2008, which immediately put the club in a very difficult financial situation. Then in August 2008, the Abu Dhabi United Group took over and immediately started pumping money into the club. In the same summer that they completed the takeover, they signed Robinho from Real Madrid for £32.5 million, thereby breaking the British transfer record. That right there was only a sign of what was to come under this new ownership. Very next summer, we saw them spend €147 million on 7 players. Emmanuel Seyi Adebayor, Gareth Barry, Kolo Toure, Carlos Tevez, Julian Lescott, Roque Santa Cruz, and Adam Johnson in one window alone. This was 2009. So it wasn't common at all, but they still hadn't returned to competing for trophies. So later that year, they hired Roberto Mancini as head coach. In his first season, he led them to 5th place in the Premier League, narrowly missing out on the Champions League spot. In 2010, the spending continued as they spent over €183 million on 7 players. Yaya Toure, Edin Dzeko, Mario Balotelli, Jerome Boateng, Alexander Kolarov, and David Silva. The next year, they added Sergio Aguero, Samir Nasri, Gail Kishley to the squad, and these guys would go on to form the core of Manchester City's first ever Premier League winning squad. But before that trophy came, they won the FA Cup in 2011 to break their 35-year trophy drought. They knocked out Manchester United in the semi-final on their way to that trophy, and that was the first time they've knocked out their neighbors out of a competition in 36 years. That season, they also qualified for the Champions League for the first time in 43 years. It was obvious to everyone who was watching that Manchester City was now back to being a top club, and it was only a matter of time before they won their first Premier League trophy. But if you thought that the 2010-11 season was good, then the 2011-12 season would have blown you away. They beat Spurs 5-1 at White Hart Lane and famously beat Manchester United 6-1 at Old Trafford. It was that match that produced the now infamous "Why Always Me" celebration from Mario Balotelli. But that was not the only thing that season that City left their neighbors in tears. That season ended most dramatically. Ahead of the final match day, Manchester City and Manchester United were locked on points, but City were sitting on top because they had a better goal difference. Therefore, all they needed to do was match United results on the last day, and they would be Premier League champion for the first time in their history. But things weren't going exactly their way that very day. By the end of the normal time, Manchester United had won their game while Manchester City were trailing 2-1. Manchester United fans and players had already started celebrating, but goals from Edin Dzeko and Sergio Aguero in added time turned things around in City's favor, and they won their first ever Premier League title and their first league title in 44 years in the craziest of fashion ever. Aguero's winner in the 94th minute is regarded as one of the greatest goals in the Premier League history, and some have even named it the greatest moment in the history of the league. It remains the only time in Premier League history that champions were decided on goal difference. But the following season, Manchester City were not as good as we expected them to be. They finished 11 points behind Manchester United, got knocked out in the group stage of the Champions League, and were hit with a shocker in the FA Cup final, where they lost to a relegated Wigan Athletic. All this led to Mancini's sack, and he was replaced by Manuel Pellegrini, who won them another Premier League title and 2 League Cups, and led them to the semi-final of the Champions League for the first time in their history. He also memorably signed Kevin De Bruyne, who would go on to become one of the greatest players in the club's entire history. But in 2016, Pellegrini was replaced by Pep Guardiola. And well, you can guess what followed: a period of insane dominance in England. Under the guidance of Pep Guardiola, Manchester City became the first club to finish with 100 points in a single Premier League season, the first English club to complete a domestic treble, the first club to win 4 Premier League titles in a row, the second English club to complete a European treble, among other very impressive records. But the story of Pep era is never complete without talking about the signings he made. He spent truckloads of money season after season to bring superstars to the Etihad, including Erling Haaland, Jack Grealish, John Stone, Rodri, among others. But these millions brought Manchester City under a lot of scrutiny. Rival fans accused them of ruining the sport by attempting to buy trophies. But more consequentially, they've been investigated by UEFA and the Premier League for allegedly breaching the financial fair play rules. UEFA infamously banned them from European competition in 2020. But after the club appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sports, the ban was overturned, covering that some allegations were beyond the 5-year limit for UEFA investigation, while the rest were unproven. So Manchester City were allowed to compete in the Champions League in 2020-21 season, and they went on to reach the final for the first time in their history. They lost that game 1-0 to Chelsea, but they would finally get their hands on the trophy in 2023 after beating Inter Milan 1-0 in the final to end a 7-year wait for the big year in the Pep Guardiola era. That win also completed the European treble for Manchester City that season, making them the second English club to achieve that feat after Manchester United did it in 1999. Interestingly, Manchester City defeated Manchester United in the FA Cup final to complete that memorable treble, and that made it a tad bit sweeter. In 2024, they became the first club to forfeit the Premier League, and they very nearly did the double, that is winning the FA Cup and the Premier League back-to-back season. But Manchester United managed to stop them in the FA Cup final. Now, it looks like they've entered a new era. The 2024-25 season was quite bad for Manchester City. Manchester City had to struggle to eventually end third in one of the most horrible seasons for Pep Guardiola since he came on board in 2016. They ended third in the Premier League, got knocked out by eventual winner Paris Saint-Germain in the Champions League, and also failed to defend their FA Cup. According to rumors, Pep Guardiola and Kevin De Bruyne had a fallout that led to the exit of Kevin De Bruyne to Italy. Will Pep Guardiola able to reenact the dominance he had when he won 4 Premier League on the bounce? Will Man City ever return back to the impeccable form they were from 4-5 years ago? That is the story of Manchester City Football Club. For more, you can go to our Facebook page, JPAC TV, or on our YouTube page,